1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 6, 3.
We're going to begin with a listening exercise, so bear with me. One, two, three. 1, 2, 1, 3. 1, 2, 3. 3, 2, 1. 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 3. 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. 3. 1, 2, 1, 3. 1, 3. 1, 3. 17. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 3. 1, 2, 3. 3, 2, 1. 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 3. 1, 1, 3. 17. 17. 17. 17. 17. 17. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 2. 1, 2, 3. Order. Chaos. Direction. Misdirection. A beginning without an end without a beginning. She sang beyond the genius of the sea. She sang beyond the genius of the sea. She sang beyond the genius of the sea. Henceforth thou art the genius of the sea. The sea grows old in it. I sing to thee of shine, and shine swam on alone, and shine swam on alone, and shine swam on alone. Shine on, you crazy diamond. Sur le pont Mirabeau coule la Seine, et nous aimons, faut-il qu'il m'en souvienne. La joie venait toujours après la peine. Allow me to try my NPR voice on you. You are listening to the music of Nico Muhly, whose Hitchcockian opera Marnie was performed at the Metropolitan Opera last season. He wrote a made-for-TV aria for the third season of Mozart in the Jungle, a show I hold very dear to my heart, and I still haven't gotten over being canceled, but that's another story for another day. You should watch it many times if you haven't seen it before. On the show, Gabriel García Bernal's character, a conductor, flies to Venice to lead a diva's comeback concert. He persuades the singer to try something new. A Nico Muhly aria based on the Long Island Lolita tabloid case in which a teenager named Amy Fisher shot the wife of her lover, Joey Buttafuoco. Hey, let's not forget about it. It's sung here by the soprano Susanna Phillips, who happens to be my sister. That's not true. We're not related at all. But I'm a poet, and I'm here to lie to you. My sister Susanna appeared in La Boheme quite recently at the Met. I'd like to welcome you to the mess of my mind. Note, I didn't say the mess in my mind. This is my mind. There's not much else there. If in the time we're together you happen to find something else, I don't know, like some math, how to use PowerPoint, any idea what an IRA is? Actually, any type of financial planning at all. Please let me know, because I'd be welcome to any of that. But my mind is basically made up of flotsam bits and pieces of words, sonic intent, and images. The person you see here before you, Rowan Ricardo Phillips, is a translation of so many things. And a slant rhyme. My father's name is Rowan, but I'm not a junior. We don't have the same middle name, and we don't have the same last name. His last name is Philip. My mom, thinking, I don't want my kid to spend his whole life having his first name and last name confused, just tacked an S at the end of my last name, and here I am. I tell you these things because we've become a type of community that desires and demands that I open the door to you. And I like that, because I'm innately a private writer. If you pick up any of my books of poetry, you'll find that they don't have notes at the back of them. My poems don't have any gloss in front of them. If the world is a ledge at the end of the known, then what is the poem at its best, if not the first air after the ledge? That first step where the imagination and our annihilation become one. So let's go there. Let's go. 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Weave a circle round him thrice and close your eyes in holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. Lines, 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 always creating meaning for me. If anyone shared drinks with us last night at the lip of the Atlantic in the Gulf of Mexico, you would have found me many times starting Wallace Stevens' Idea of Order, Key West, hoping someone would jump in with me. It's not that I want to be that person, but it's how I understand sunsets. It's how I understand epiphanies. It's how, in a way, I understand this place. She sang beyond the genius of the sea. The water never formed to mind or voice, like a body, holy body, fluttering its empty sleeves. Welcome this morning to a small sampling of my inspirations and captured fleeting moments of the mind in the act of finding that which will suffice. Welcome to my notebook. I wanted to take you inside of my notebook because I want you to understand what a notebook is to me. Without facts, there cannot be faith. Reginald Shepard. I write a great majority of my work first in my head. I would say about 85 to 90%. I'm an avid walker. I like the risk of forgetting ideas. I know what you think. Always have a notebook with you so that when you have an idea, write it down. But I actually like living with the risk of forgetting something. Because, hey, if you forget it, How memorable was it? I like to live with that risk. I like that some of you chuckled because there is something kind of funny about the potential catastrophe of losing work. But I like being able to fish for it. What was it I thought? Was it a good idea? How did it go again? Begin again. So what you tend to see in my notebooks and in my image boards are encounters after the fact, me starting to write and remembering what I've seen. This is a poem called The Beatitudes of Malibu in my last book of poems, Heaven. I was in Los Angeles because I was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award, which went to the collected poems of Louise Glick. We tell you, I told you that I'm going to be very open with you. When Louise Glick won that award, someone whispered in my ear, "You just lost to all of the work of Louise Glick. That's not fair." My reaction was, if I'm going to lose an award, I'd much rather lose an award to everything that Louise Glick has written. But I wrote this poem on the plane going back from LA to New York. My wife got an upgrade. She went to first class, so I was sitting by myself. That is not a lie. That's a true story. And so I kept myself company with the music that had been floating in my head. I'd never seen the Pacific before. The Atlantic always makes sense to me. The Gulf of Mexico makes sense to me. The Mediterranean makes sense to me. These are parts of my upbringing, parts of who I am. But facing the Pacific and knowing out on the other side was Asia and a world I'm not familiar with, my mind started to make music of it. I wrote a good portion of Heaven when I was in Woody Creek, Colorado, 5 miles or so outside of Aspen, where Hunter S. Thompson lived and his wife still lives. I was put up in a small little cabin where Margaret Thatcher and George Bush had their summit in 1990. I was with no one, I had no internet, and I stayed on East Coast time. So I found myself getting up at 4, going to bed at 9. I only brought 2 books, Shakespeare's complete works, and a wonderful book called The Art of Shakespeare's Language. I found myself taking pictures. This was one sunset. I found myself taking pictures, not necessarily because I thought, oh, I'd like to write about that, but I wanted to capture these moments so that after the fact of these poems, I could come back and see where my mind had been, what sense I was trying to make of what I saw. This is a poem called Mark and Lucas, which I actually wrote in the Met. I was surrounded by 2 works of Chuck Close, one being Mark, and the other being a first version of Lucas. Where are you, my friend? There you go. Now, as we went down the well on Thursday with Margaret Atwood and her images, I found myself thinking, as I always do when I think of Margaret, she started with poetry. She is a poet. Nevertheless, she persisted. She forms a type of archetype. My father-in-law, one of the very best people I know in this world, hopes that I also can embrace someday. Namely, the poet who has a Harry Potter in him. This is also very true. But aren't we supposed to get over this? Poetry, I mean. Aren't we supposed to grow up and leave the songs behind? Isn't the arc of a life the movement from the jingle to the newspaper? From bedtime with a children's book to a nightcap with a Ron Chernow biography? But what's happened is you end up in a trance with poetry, and you may never leave it. There are these voices in my head, pictures behind my eyes that I find that I'm not done with yet. I saw that in the morning when I'm feeling good in this kind of Nina Simone way. I feel that I could get past it, that I can do something else. I could pick up a newspaper, I could write a great biography. But come the evening, I already know the truth again. It's not that I can be done with poetry. It's that poetry will be done with me when poetry is done with me. Thus, I'm in search of a way to perfect my craft, oddly while acutely aware that there has never been a perfect poet. The writing of poetry is a courtship with error. Homer's military history was wrong. Dante's cosmology was wrong. The first monster in The Fairy Queen is error. Donne's alchemy was wrong. Keats' geography was wrong. Pound's economics were horribly, horribly wrong. And you already know if I'm saying somebody's economics are wrong, imagine how wrong they must have been. Perfection, in other words, is not a part of poetry's past, nor part of its future. As if I craved error, Claudia Rankine wrote, as if love was ahistorical. The love we find through poetry is entirely and necessarily ahistorical. Poetry is an iridescent pinwheel that, as it turns, reveals its poets in quickly passing, flickering moments. Some stay with us longer than others, touch us deeper than others, and enliven us with what, for a poet, is far greater than admiration: envy. This is what I find that people get wrong sometimes when they ask poets about other poets. Who inspired you? Whose work do you admire? Whose work do you love? That's a category, and then envy is the other, the upgrade. And so as I face what's come before me, I'm full of both wonder and envy. Nature. This is what I sound like when I'm thinking. I read and I learn and I grow, first by the syllable, then by the word, then by the line, then by the stanza, then the poem, then the book, then the oeuvre. Poets love other poets strangely. Are there any poets in the room? I love you. It's a love that feels not quite ahistorical, but again, and importantly, atemporal. Call it an inherited power, a love that moves the sun and other stars. Of course, that's the last line in the Divine Comedy, and I've actually been pastiching so many lines with so many poets. Only when writing and reading become inseparable from each other, though, when the bounds of their membranes melt away and everything thereafter becomes a sweet and messy synthesis of sound and sense, temperament and tempo, past and present without beginning and end, only then can a poet truly reckon with influence. The question typically asked of a poet, and one I talked about briefly last year, is, who are your influences? In fact, I was asked that again yesterday at the high school. The ubiquity of the question is more significant than any answer it may provide. To begin with, the question presumes the poet has a perfect, unleveraged sense of her or his work. But we know that's not true. I just lost my train of thought. I love when that happens. So I would like to take you actually to a problem that represents this situation of influence and atemporality. It's something I find myself increasingly obsessed with because I realize as I get older how belated we are to things and how much our intentions change. I remember after September 11th saying I would never, ever write a poem about September 11th. My book, The Ground, is often considered a book of post-September 11th poetry. Irony always kind of gets you in the end. When I didn't have children, I was always adamant that I wouldn't write poems about children. Not because I have any problems with children or poetry about children, but when I looked at poems such as Vothke's My Papa's Waltz or The Great Frost at Midnight by Coleridge, I thought that was already done, and I didn't really have much to say about that. But I'd always come back to Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, even when I didn't have children, because there was a torque in it that I understood innately. It was a bridge across the centuries. It was a bridge across the ocean. It was a bridge across Coleridge's opium-addled mind and my completely pristine, untouched by alcohol or any other types of substances mind, of course. And so I've always found myself wondering, since I first read Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, I should give you a bit of a history of that poem with me. I knew the poem really well. I get poetry largely from my mother, who's a great lover of Shakespeare and always was walking around the house reciting Shakespeare lines at me, which is fun to an extent, but then when you say things like, "Mom, what's for dinner?" and you get back to be or not to be, whether 'tis nobler in mind to suffer the outrageous slings of fortune, etc. But so I found when I went to college, I went to Swarthmore College, and I have a habit of, I don't know if anybody else does this. Does anybody else do this? I don't write down the code of library books when I go to the library to look for something. I just kind of walk around until I find it. You have a sense of what the PAs are, the PRs are, the PSs are, the Ds are. After a while, you understand the code. And I like the messiness of the adjacent books, right? All of a sudden you see them as opposed to just looking for the number until you find it. When I went to Swarthmore, I realized wonderful things like that I could basically hide in the library and sleep there. And I also found a recording of Coleridge's conversation poems, Frost at Midnight, Dejection and Ode, but also the demonic ones like Kubla Khan, and they were read by Christopher Plummer. It was marvelous. It was also on a cassette tape that, sorry, Swarthmore, I think I took it. But ironically, who uses cassette tape? I don't know where it is. I hope no one from Swarthmore hears this and sends me a bill. But influence becomes not just about author, but it comes about sonic possession. It's very hard for me to read Frost at Midnight without Plummer's intonation. It's hard for me to read any of Coleridge's conversation poems or the demonic poems without Plummer's intonation. So instead of hearing, "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree," I hear, "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree." Right? And I also find myself wondering, though, as I listen to that recording, falling asleep to it, waking up to it, the moment where I met Coleridge, here it is. His son Hartley is sleeping beside him. He's in the country. It's late at night. Everyone's asleep. It's cold. There's fire in the fireplace. He's thinking about how great it is to be in the country. And he turns to Hartley and he says, "For I was reared in the great city, pent mid cloisters dim, and saw naught lovely but the sky and stars." I remember that. I remember the change in my life when I found myself leaving New York for the first time to spend some like quality time someplace else in America. I would always go to the Caribbean when I was a kid, but I hadn't really traveled through the middle of America. I wondered when I was a teenager whether I wanted to act. I worked for Summer Stock Theater in the Susquehanna Valley when I was 16, and it was my first time kind of out in the valleys and towards the plains. And the show must go on, so we spent a lot of nights pulling all-nighters, building sets. Why, do you ask, was I building sets? Because that year I was at Summerstock, they were just doing musicals, and I am a terrible singer, as you've already discovered. But I wanted to be around actors and see how they live. So I was building sets, and one night we had to build a big set, so we were outside. And you look up and we saw this wonderful starscape, and everyone started to gasp. And then there was a silence as everyone was regarding the stars. And then I just said instinctively, wow, it's just like the planetarium. And that's when I realized something was wrong with me. There's a wonderful moment in Rilke's archaic torso of Apollo. Rilke, who was kicked out of Rodin's studio because Rilke was annoying, went around the Louvre, found this wonderful torso, headless, armless, legless, and this gorgeous poem he's describing the power in that stone sculpture. You can't see its face. It's older than thought, but you can feel the power like a feral thing. And the description is so vibrant and perfect and concise. Does anybody remember the last line of that poem? You must change your life. Du musst dein Leben ändern. When the of planetarium came out of my mouth, I realized I must change my life. And so, Frosted Midnight continued. But thou, my babe, shall wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountain and beneath the clouds, which image in their bulk both lakes and shores and mountain crags. I found myself first escaping to nature because I thought that I lived a life that was devoid of nature. It took me a few years to realize that my urban upbringing, and I say urban without any type of sociological gloss on that. Sometimes when we say urban, we mean poor or black. I grew up one, but not the other. I mean the city, cityscapes, having your sunlight interrupted, just understanding your space and the natural world through skyscrapers and bridges. Another way of thinking about nature. So I found nature outside of the city. I came back to cities and found nature there. Wrote books of poetry, had children, and all of a sudden, the back end of Frosted Midnight, as I had children, started to illuminate in ways that this front end that I just read to you didn't. I want to read you how Frosted Midnight ends. And I want you to think about, as you hear this, the fact that the second line is in the subjunctive. And it's okay if you don't know what the subjunctive is, because Arlo didn't know who Northrop Frye is. So that's much worse than you not knowing what the subjunctive is. The little joke in Margaret also mentioning Northrop Frye at her talk is that Northrop Frye is Canadian. We're mentioning Northrop Frye a lot, I think, because we're all kind of in canon in our head in one way or another these days. Therefore, all seasons shall be sweet to thee. Whether the summer clothe the general earth with greenness, or the red breasts sit and sing betwixt the tufts of snow on the bare branch of mossy apple tree, while the nigh thatch smokes in the sun thaw. Whether the eavesdrops fall, heard only in the trances of the blast, or if the secret ministry of frost shall hang them up in silent icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon. Now, that's an ending of a poem that is soft. It lands almost like a Chopin piece, right? Chopin's nocturnes kind of rock you to sleep at the end, no matter where they go in the middle, in the second part. But the transition at the end, therefore, all seasons shall be sweet to thee. Whether summer clothe the general earth. Amidst all that beautiful description and the wonderful landing of the poem, I found myself captured by the most boring word in that passage, which of course is therefore. I would like to suggest to you that being able to turn on such an innocent, banal, prosaic word like therefore is actually where power comes from. You cannot begin a work of imagination saying therefore. But when you can turn after saying, for I was reared in the great city, pent mid cloisters dim, and saw not lovely but the sky and stars, but thou, my babe, shalt wander like a breeze. Therefore, all seasons shall be sweet to thee. To be able to bestow upon your child not a hope, but a certainty. Because of this vision, because of this utterance, all things shall come to you with sweetness. The subjunctive, of course, is one of these wonderfully fussy things for English speakers. English is such a wonderfully weird language. We're so blessed to have it as our first language because we don't get caught up with all of these ways in which it doesn't make sense, right? Like through and tough rhyming, but why do they get pronounced differently, etc. And I have great respect for everyone who's learned English as a second or third or fourth language because it's just a mashup language that, what do we do with it? But for that reason also, we use the subjunctive in a way that we don't tend to recognize. The subjunctive, of course, is the conjugation of hope, of wishing, right? I wish you a very nice day. I hope someday the Jets are half decent, right? But of course, I hope someday, and you go, okay, that's nice, the Jets will be half decent. That's not going to happen. That's where the subjunctive exists, right? It teeters between its subject, right, and its verb, but then what comes after, it's ambiguous. We don't know. It's of dreams, hopes, fears, doubts, right? So for those of you who know French or German, Romance languages in particular, you're quite familiar with the subjunctive in ways that we are not. But prophecy is a risky, mussy, fussy, muddled thing. And I find myself coming back constantly to this moment. This kind of tucked away power of prophecy in Coleridge. The confidence of the therefore. The poet from the city who tries to clear the field for the child, to be elsewhere, to do something, anything else. But it didn't work out. Sometimes poetry trips the poet up in prophecy. Poor Hartley Coleridge became a poet. You won't know any of his poems. You'll know him from his appearance at 1 year old in Frost at Midnight. He didn't know that was as good as it would get for him in poetry. But in his beginning was his end. I ended up writing a poem that will be in my next book called Dark Matter Ode. I was recently in St. Louis visiting St. Louis University, and I was visited there at my reading by the marvelous poet Carl Phillips, who happens to be my cousin. That's not true, we're not related. But I read this poem, Dark Matter Ode, and he came up to me after and he said, "That's Frost at Midnight." And I said, you know what? Yeah. I want to read this poem to you. And I want to try to suggest to you that influence works in the following way. I paused when Carl said, you know, that's Frost at Midnight. Because when you make art at its best, something kind of weird happens to you. You lose sense of time as being a progression of 1, 2, 3, 4. You lose a sense of sequence. You lose a sense of who came before you, this is the next step for the artist, not to think, I am after Homer, I am after Shakespeare, I am after Zora Neale Hurston, I am after Virgil, I am after Homer. Notice how I'm cycling and cycling and cycling. When you cycle, you end up in a position where sometimes you feel like you're ahead, sometimes you're behind. I love when people say, oh, I love the Stevens in your work. And I say, I love that young poets are influenced by me. Because sometimes I like to think that. I read Wallace Stevens' poems and I think, oh, that must have been influenced by my poetry, right? You lose the timeline. You don't make a lot of money writing poetry, but you do have control over sequence, and you can break it. And so here's a little poem that I wrote that inspired Coleridge to write Frost and Midnight. It's called Dark Matter Ode. And with that, I'll end and say thank you very much. Dark Matter Ode. You'll say you can't remember. You were too young. That the idea wasn't yours. Or maybe you'll feel the need to feel misunderstood and say, you don't understand. You don't understand. You don't. Any parents go through that with their kids? But I was there when the sky closed. I know that brief darkness feels good. That God works on no sleep, as certain as Brer's sleep, reclining in his lampshade, sweet Brer's sleep, who knows nothing of sleep, his song swelling in my wrists as they hang on your crib, leaning in, inspecting you like a crook. I am the poet in his pillory. I see you as free. I sing of the wood, and I sing of the bars. I am the dunce of the stars who sings of the bars. Poets know time is a dead man walking. We are all the terrorist Tichborne. I love that you sleep so softly despite the virus of my verbal flailings flowing through your veins. One day, you will be facing it, the reflective, black immensity of it all. And you will seethe and set out into a world of science and anger that I just can't imagine. Today won't matter to you because today to you won't be by then today, which went like this. There was the IMAX movie about dark matter and the protests about how Black lives matter. But then for you, the same sleep. And then a million years from now, somewhere, discovering that something like this one moment could have happened, could have mattered. That you, asleep in your crib, were a god in the machine. And that poem your father wrote you was a fucking living weapon. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.